Thank you, Penny. Well, thank you for coming to the fourth Bicknell, Dr. Frank Bicknell Lecture of the 2013-2014 season. As many of you know, our lectures are in September, October, November, then back after the winter, and it certainly was a hard one, in March, April, and May. The remaining lectures after tonight, the next one is here on the third Wednesday in April. It's Detroit Surgeons 300 Years, 2011 book by Dr. Larry Stevenson, who is a former board member of the Grosse Pointe Historical Society and a Grosse Pointe resident. And this book chronicles the surgical history of the Detroit area during the past 3 centuries, with the founding in 1868 of the Detroit Medical College, the forerunner of Wayne State's medical school. It focuses on the medical school's surgery department, but then along the way tells the history of many of the hospitals and surgeons in the area. Larry will actually be our speaker again in May, and May is always our program that we co-sponsor with the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House for Preservation Month, and that will be covering Larry's upcoming book, The Centennial of the Grosse Pointe Yacht Club. And of course, that club was founded in 1914 through the efforts of 25 sailing and ice boating enthusiasts that had wanted to create a private sailing club. And the Italian Renaissance style clubhouse was designed in 1924 by Guy Lowell of Boston. And although he died at sea before the plans were fully developed. The concept for the building, though, continued on and as the sun-washed stucco walls and the terracotta tile and topped by the 187-foot steeple. And it certainly is a spectacular monument to his creative genius. Clubhouse opened officially, though, the current one in 1929, virtually on the eve of the Great Depression, but the club survived and has flourished. Tonight's program is the 2012 book, Border Crossings, the Detroit River Region in the War of 1812. Our speaker tonight will be autographing copies in the back afterwards. Tonight our speaker will explore the changing political alliances of the Detroit River region during the War of 1812, which of course continued through 1814. So we're still marking the centennial of that conflict. For more than a generation, American citizens, British subjects, French settlers, Native Americans, and African slaves and free slaves routinely crossed the border while living and working together in the most diverse region in North America. But that tranquility was suddenly broken with the War of 1812. The book's authors include Denver Brunsman, Assistant Professor of History at George Washington University, Douglas Fisher, Managing Editor at Crane Communications, and tonight's speaker, Joel Stone, who is a Senior Curator at the Detroit Historical Society, which oversees, of course, the Detroit Historical Museum, the Doss Museum, the Fort Wayne, and over 250,000 artifacts in the city of Detroit's collection. A native of the Detroit area, and an Austin High School graduate, and Fairholme Street, right? I mean, we're just a few blocks from where he grew up. He studied journalism, history, archaeology, and archival management at the University of Detroit, Wayne State University, and University College Cork in Ireland. He supports a number of regional historical organizations and is a member of the Association of Great Lakes Maritime History. I'll give you Joel Stone. Thank you, Joel.
Thanks all for coming. I see lots of familiar faces, and that's always nice. Hello, Tom. And as many times as I bicycled past the school, it's the first time I've ever been in it. Of course, coming from Fairholme and heading to the library down at Parcells, passing this Farmer Jack, Woods Bowling Alley,
Howard Johnson.
Howard Johnson's.
Right, yeah.
Right. So, and I always wondered what was in this. It's a beautiful building. I'm glad you guys were involved and were able to save it. It's a wonderful thing. The War of 1812, this is a great project. It's a project that we worked with Denver Brunsman, who's now at George Washington University, or rather, the George Washington University, as I've been corrected. Was at the Wayne State University for a long time. And we worked with him on a couple of projects. We did a book prior to this called Revolutionary Detroit, dealing with Detroit slightly before, during, and after the Revolutionary War. And then we picked it up 3 years later and did the same thing with the War of 1812, slightly before, slightly during, and slightly after the War of 1812. Great project, 21 writers. It was a class specifically designed for this book. Had about 35 students, of which 21 produced papers that were worthy of getting printed and really advanced the literature on the War of 1812 related to the Detroit River region. And I say the Detroit River region because once you left Buffalo, Detroit was anything from Toledo to Port Huron. Mackinac was anything from Detour to the Beaver Islands. Okay, so it was a very broadly based category. And of course, in the Detroit River region, it hadn't been a border for so long. And people lived on both sides, they had friends on both sides, they knew people on both sides, and that was a big part of the story that went in, the many stories, the 21 stories that are in the book. I do want to ask, how many people know that we had a War of 1812? Yeah, good, that's good. How many people are sick and tired of the War of 1812? All right, that's good, I'm glad about that too. Many of us started the planning process for things like this and different symposiums several years ago. And so there's a lot of folks who have just about had it with the War of 1812, and I'm glad you're not among them. I'm also glad I've got to go down and do this same presentation down in Monroe, and Monroe, of course, is the River Raisin battlefield and all the Brownstown battles and things that happened down there. Those people that's ground zero for the War of 1812. So I'm real happy to have a friendly audience to kind of run this through a couple of times. I didn't have done it before. I did it actually over in Manitowoc, Wisconsin was the first place. So it was broadly based around the Great Lakes, and now I've kind of revised it and brought it much, much closer to home, because this is, in fact, what the book is about. If we start with the real basic facts, the world as it was during the War of 1812, for those of us who understand that American history is started and has been for a long time, especially during this period, Eurocentric history, this was the center of the world right here. It had nothing to do with us. America was as far away as it is in this picture, okay? And so many of the people lived right along the coast. We had gone through this tremendous war with Britain, and we won kind of by a matter of attrition. And the War of 1812 it's like it started the day the Revolutionary War ended. It was a long time coming, it was a long time brewing, it had to do with several factors. Probably the most prominent is impressment of American seamen, which led to the Chesapeake Leopard affair in 1807. But also there were things, political things, as the Americans at that point were basically what we would call the truck drivers of the world at that point. In America, you could build ships very cheaply. Because everybody lived along the seacoast, they were all seamen. Everybody could tie a knot. Everybody could hand a sail. And so it was a very maritime-oriented culture, especially to the north. Not so much to the south, but definitely to the north. So the Americans were carrying a lot of the stuff that the French bought, that the Dutch bought, that the English bought. We were kind of the carriers for all of that. And it got us into the middle when the French and the English went to war. It was quite a problem. The French said, if you carry English goods, we're going to take your ships. And the English said, if you carry French goods, we're going to take your ships. And it really put American merchantmen, who were making a fortune at that time, both in whaling and carrying cargoes, into a very compromised position, and it was a real problem. Jefferson, president at that point, forwarded the Embargo Act, again in 1807, and it was an absolute disaster. For a president that we respect so highly, it was a blunder of almost catastrophic proportions, almost put the carriers who were in business out of business. And finally, it got to the point where the American public wanted to go to war. They didn't really want to do that in the Revolutionary War. By the time they got to the War of 1812, they were ready to go to war. And of course, Jefferson was the guy who said, taking over we kind of thought the Canadians would want to become part of the United States, of course. Our experiment was so cool, and we made it successful, we figured we'd just go up there and say, hey, you guys want to join us? And Jefferson said, winning this war is just as easy as marching north. Also proved to be wrong. Of course, none of this that was going on in the Atlantic region, and of course there was the triangle trade was going on very strongly at this point, so this was kind of the center of the world, and we were not. The Great Lakes was hugely separated. 90%, 94% of the population lived along this coast. And you got mountains that run from there to there that made it really difficult to get to the other side. There was an area through here that you could get into the Ohio country. And in fact, it was the Ohio country that was developing faster than the Great Lakes for a couple of reasons. It was surprising in that traveling on water was by far the best way to travel. Coach travel was god-awful. Horseback was wonderful if you could afford it, but you really couldn't carry much luggage. So water was really the way to go. Erie Canal hadn't come along yet, so getting into this way, you could either travel up the Hudson and through, Lake George and stuff to get there, which is pretty much where Jefferson figured we'd walk into Canada, or you could get up into the Mohawk Valley and come over, and that's how most of the folks who were coming from the east came into the Great Lakes. But they were flooding into this area here. And the major reason for that was Britain. Britain had Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and oddly enough, Upper Canada is lower than Lower Canada. It was all done by which way the water flowed. The water flowed that way. Upstream is up. Down east was up here, because that was downwind. Most of the people who came in and were living in this area were either French families who had been here for 100 years, had come in, the French government had tried to promote farming. And actually, Michigan, and Detroit in particular, except this winter, is a fairly moderate place. I mean, if you've got friends, I've got relatives who live in Wisconsin. They regularly get 30 degrees below zero. We don't. This Detroit was actually a fairly moderate place, great soil. It was a nice place to be. So we did have some French farmers, and in fact, 95% of the people here during the war were of French descent until we started getting the soldiers that came up to help us win the battles. There were Americans, but not many of them. Okay, in fact, when they first made Detroit a town, the first 5 trustees, 4 of them were French and 1 of them was British. They eventually found one guy who was American. He had French background, but he had become an American citizen, and he was kind of the token American in the American town. Traders, fur trappers, farmers, and many of them did all 3. So that was it. The people, the professionals who were here were government folk who would come in, the governors, the judges, the surveyors, the land folks, were the government people who had come, but there weren't many. And we had a tiny little garrison of maybe 50 soldiers who basically took care of the city and closed the gates at night so the Indians wouldn't come in. It was a pretty back river place. British controlled the shipping on the lakes. They had what they called the Provincial Marine, which was essentially cargo ships, private cargo ships that they paid the crews to operate. The British Navy was in charge of them, but there wasn't but 1 or 2 official British naval officers that ran the Provincial Marine. Everybody else was kind of sworn deputies at the time, until the war came along. And really the only land route into Detroit was right around the south here, right in through the Black Swamp. I mean, I don't know if anybody's been down to Trenton to see Hull's Trace down there. They had to build a corduroy road just to get over the swamps, hundreds of miles long. Most of it's gone now, but there are parts of it down there that you can still see. But getting here by foot or by horseback was trouble. Getting in by a schooner or by a canoe, by far canoes were the most popular. That was the way to go. Now, arguably, the War of 1812 began and ended in the Detroit River region. We had 4 major theaters that went on here as far as theaters of war. There was the area over around Kingston, Ontario, and up in the Sackett's Harbor. Major military, naval fleets were getting built and basically chased each other around Lake Ontario for 4 years. Not engaging, knowing that if they engaged and one side lost and the other won, the control of the lake would fall to the winner. And neither of the commanders wanted to do that. It was only later on that they built a small fleet over Erie, which did end up changing the balance of power on the lakes. The first shots of the War of 1812 were fired from the area right down where Fort Wayne is, known as spring wells. some militia guys dragged a cannon out of Fort Detroit downriver so that they could shoot at the Canadians in Sandwich. General Hull hadn't arrived yet. He wasn't very happy when he found out, but the first shots of the war, land-based war, were fired right here in Detroit. The first invasion, once Hull arrived, he decided he could take Canada. And the idea was that there was kind of a three-pronged attack that would come, well, four-pronged, come in here, come in there, and then go up into Quebec. And you know, again, the Canadians are just going to roll over and say, welcome! They didn't. So that the invasion happened, crossed into Detroit, into Sandwich, set up some fortifications. In fact, there's a great story in there about how they took over the Bobby House, which is still extant over in Windsor, and turned it into a fortification as it had about halfway through its build. Then marched down toward Malden, got as far as this little creek here, where the British and the Native Americans, more the Native Americans, had set up a block and drove Hull back. It wasn't but a few days later when Brock, General Brock, the British commander, arrived from Queenston and ended up coming in and taking over Detroit. And that was another problem, of course, the first major U.S. defeats in the war. On the high seas, the American ships had won everything they could win. They were doing very well. We were actually winning the war until we had several. Fort Mackinac fell on July 7th. The war was declared June 18th. Okay, so that was the first. Fort Mackinac fell July 17th, which would have been up there. In fact, I think I've got a picture of it. It was about that size, garrison of 65. Not long afterwards, August 15th, Fort Dearborn fell over where Chicago is now. And then, of course, Detroit fell on August 16th. So the first major defeats, but also the first war cry. If the Spanish-American War was Remember the Maine, the War of 1812 was Remember the Raisin, which was the River Raisin Massacre. That became the rallying cry that they used on the East Coast. They used throughout the rest of the war. That massacre was a huge thing. And of course, the big turning point of the war, of at least the war in this part of the world, was the Battle of Lake Erie. You know, the British had controlled the Great Lakes, all of the Great Lakes, from Fort Dearborn around to Mackinac and up to Montreal. They controlled it. And in about 4 hours, 3.5 hours on Lake Erie, that all changed, just in a virtual heartbeat, historically speaking. It was also the final battle of Native American resistance in the Old Northwest. It was Tecumseh and his confederation that had gotten together and tried to fight back. And they really did. It was their war. They didn't care what the British did. And frankly, the British turned tail a few times. More times than I'd like to admit, I'm certain. But the Native Americans stuck with it until Tecumseh was dead. And then that was pretty much the end of the Confederacy. Soon after, there was the Treaty of Brownstown. And after that, then the Treaty of Fort Wayne. And most of the Native American properties in southeast Michigan had been ceded to the American government. And of course, it was Lewis Cass, who was a lieutenant and then a captain during this war, ended up becoming the governor, who then went and settled most of the other Native American claims throughout the Great Lakes, and then of course got promoted to Secretary of the Interior and was responsible for the Trail of Tears and most of the Indian replacement. And it was also the final American occupation of Upper Canada. The war officially ended right near the end of 1814, but Americans out of Detroit occupied southeastern Ontario until July of 1850. And this is 6 months after the Battle of New Orleans. You know, the war is over. We know the war is over, and yet we left troops in there to maintain it. But the book, I mean, the whole point of the book, and there are so many wonderful histories of the War of 1812, and about the War of 1812 in the Old Northwest. They're wonderful ones that deal with the battles, that deal with the soldiers, that deal with the generals. This book was not intended to be that. This book is intended to talk about the people who lived in the Detroit River region, how they interacted with the people across the river, how they interacted with the Native Americans, how the British interacted with the Americans with the French, There was just, it's as we mentioned, as you mentioned in the introduction, it was such an incredibly diverse area. And there were Germans here, and there were some other, there were some Swedes, I think, and there was, the immigration had started, and it was an incredibly diverse area. So there are people stories, and there's stories of transplants. Hull and Andrew Westbrook, who we'll talk about in a second, were people who had come from the east, Hull from Connecticut, and Cass, who had originally come from, the east and then was in Ohio and then came up this way. It was the story of locals. John Askin, we'll touch on John Askin, but anybody who's read Detroit history and dug into this period, the John Askin papers are a wealth of information, and his family played a huge part in this conflict. But there was also Alexander Grant, who we know, the Grosse Pointe Historical knows, had a house down at the foot of Moran. Big house full of daughters, and I guess great parties too, I've heard. And the Bobby family, who had been here, for a couple of generations, and Native Americans who had been coming to fish in the region for centuries. So that there were the locals, and then there were the compromised people. There were, and I think that's probably the best stories that we got out of here, were the people whose stories haven't been told. The Native American stories. We dug up some wonderful stuff. The women were the stalwarts of this war. The men left. We'll touch on that. The unfree, the slaves, they've been both African American, European, and Penny, the native peoples. And then there were just misfits. There were just people who wandered, and they wandered wherever there was meals and there was something they could do. A lot of these people you've heard about. William Hall, great story. I don't know if Tony Yannick has come out and given a talk. Tony Yannick did a great job.
2 years ago at the beginning of the marking the bicentennial of the war.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And he basically followed up on the relationship between Hull and all the people he had to deal with. And Hull was frankly a very reluctant leader. He didn't mind being governor. He really didn't want to be general. He turned the job down 3 times before he was told he was going to be the general, all right? Before he was the commander here. Didn't want to be here at all, and didn't get along with Cass at all. And Cass had powerful personality, no question about it, and a serious politician. If you've read anything about Lewis Cass, the man was, if nothing else, he was a politician through and through. He would change his attitudes with the winds, and his friends knew it as well as his enemies. And just the two of them didn't get along. And in fact, when Hull was defending the town and needed him, Cass and another lieutenant had 300 soldiers miles away, 2 or 3 miles away. And they could have either gone into the fray or turned around and gone the other way, and they went the other way. And so this is what Hull was dealing with, besides dealing with the militias. And I'm probably several slides behind here. Yeah, there's talking about the book. There's William Hull. Militias, they came out of Kentucky, they came out of Tennessee, that whole Ohio River Valley that had been developed. And these were rough and tumble guys who didn't mind walking away from home for a year or two and eating camp food and sleeping out in the open, tents. They didn't have tents. We don't need no stinking tents. So these guys were tough. And for an old soldier, hero of the Revolution, but he was past his prime. He knew it. He didn't want the job. He had to deal with these folks. Great story. There's so much more there. There's the Grant story, who had been here for a long, long time. He developed the British naval militia on the Great Lakes to control the Great Lakes. So here he is, living in the United States, controlling the British Navy during the War of 1812. He died in about 1813, and despite living in Grosse Pointe, they rowed him across the river and buried him on British soil. Brit through and through. This is the town we were dealing with, essentially, about that time. We had inherited the fort, Fort Lerneau, from the British. They built it during the Revolution, thought they needed it. And the town wasn't much bigger than this. Of course, most of the people didn't live in town. They lived on the ribbon farms, up and down the river, down the Rouge, up the Rouge, up to the Clinton River. I mean, that's most of the people lived outside of the town. And when, Hull got here, he got here about a week or 3 after this happened. The whole town burned down. The good part was the fort didn't burn, and all of your relatives across the river, they were fine. All the people on the ribbon farms, they were fine. So nobody starved. It was a thin winter, but this is what Hull walked into. And he walked into with a guy named Augustus Woodward, who was arguably eccentric or crazy, and had to deal with him as his other leader. An amazing guy, brilliant man, real hard to deal with, and the two of them went through the process of trying to rebuild the city. That in itself is a whole other story. There's a great story in here about the bank fraud. Hull knew, coming from the east, he knew we needed a bank. If we were going to sell land, you had to have a place you could go in and you could get money. So he made arrangements with some guy in Boston to start a bank. Unfortunately, the guy in Boston was a shyster and absolutely ran him. And it's a wonderful story, but here you've got one of the bank notes. Augustus Woodward was the president. Here's Flanagan, who was one of the agents of the shyster. And I believe this is supposed to be Elijah Brush, who was signed this $5 note. This is one of the things in our collection. It was wonderful, but here's Hull trying to establish a town, and he's getting absolutely laced because he invested in a bad bank, and already we've got our first public scandal. It's a wonderful thing. And lousy communication. Hull hasn't even arrived with his troops. He's coming up that corduroy road through the Black Swamp. He puts the women and a couple of sick soldiers and all of his communications on the Cayuga and sent it up, and didn't know the war had started. Now the British found out, and if you think about it, the war was declared and it had to come to the British from London. Hull only had to get word from Washington, and the British got the word faster. In Washington, they put a stamp on an envelope and sent it to Hull saying, "We're at war." It got kind of held up in Cincinnati, and it just never quite made it. So as the Cayuga's going by Malden, the British just row up and hold up their guns and say, "We want your boat." And they got it. And they got all Hull's communications, so he was, he'd already started on a bad foot. And things were not going well for him. Alexander Grant, I mentioned, got the British fleet up and running, and if there were private vessels, they were immediately drawn into the British service. And one of the private vessels was owned by this guy, John Askin. And he left a beautiful volume. Well, he left the papers, and then Milo Quaife, who was one of the Detroit historians, put it all together into a volume. And it was interesting because Askin wrote both in English and in French. He had married a French wife in Detroit. He actually had moved to Mackinac first, married an English woman, had a son by her, then decided to move his business to Detroit. He manumitted her to her family and brought the son with him, and then married into a French family down here, the Barth family. And the Askin family was incredibly important in the whole story of the war. He traded up north. He had a large family. His son, by the Indian woman, went back up and lived at Fort St. Joseph, which was up kind of near Detour, what is now Detour, Michigan, and was involved in the raid on Mackinac. Remember, these are British folks. John Askin lived in Detroit, and when it became Detroit territory, he was one of those first trustees, but within a few years he moved across to the area that's now Walkerville, and sold his house to his son-in-law, Elijah Brush, who, unfortunately, Askin owned the property much longer than Brush did, but Brush got the street named after him. But Elijah Brush was an American, and Elijah Brush fought for the American side. Meanwhile, Askin's sons and his extended family are all involved in the British side of the war. The interesting part is the kind of the relationship and that went on between the family, and I've got a whole other presentation about smuggling on the Detroit River, which is great, but these guys were doing it in the open. In fact, Brush said here, when the son, Elijah Jr., who's up in St. Joseph and had wanted some liquor and things sent up to him, he said, "Brush disappointed me. He was to have sent a barrel of cider too. If he could as well smuggle cider to our side as wine to his side." If he had sent it to Makina, addressed to Dr. Mitchell, and wrote the doctor that it was intended for me, I would have had it in my storehouse long ago. We have a method in this quarter, unknown below, how to import and export into the U.S. And they did, constantly. And there's great stories, great letters whereby Brush is asking for his mother-in-law to send him across celery plants, and he's sending off things that he can get across the way. The trading went on. Even though they were at war, they fought in different armies. These people are talking to each other as in-laws across the Detroit River. I mean, it was a highway. They almost ignored it as a border. In the end, the Askin family, hugely involved. Brush was an officer with the American militia. Adelaide went across and stayed with French relatives in Canada. John Jr. up at St. Joseph's, a son-in-law and a great-grandson were at the River Raisin. One of the grandsons injured and eventually died. Charles, his son, British Army, served throughout Upper Canada, over near Buffalo, over near Kingston. Archange's husband was in England and then Nova Scotia. And Adelaide, Archange, and Teresa's husbands all died while in service. So the Brush family was incredibly invested in the war. As much as they didn't want it, it was bad for business. Senior was a fur trader, dealing with McGraw and Todd in Montreal, and it basically put him out of business. He died in April 1815, while the Americans were still occupying Ontario, what's now Ontario, Upper Canada. So it was a tough time for John Askin and his family. I think I put this in here to discuss all the different areas. Let me get to the other side here. One of the fun stories that I really appreciated was this guy named Andrew Westwood. And Meg McGowan did a wonderful bit on him. To the Americans, he was a hero. To the Canadians, he was a villain. He's a guy, if Mel Gibson's looking for another movie to make, this is the guy. He had a wonderful farm in Ontario, kind of over near the Thames River. So on the southern side of Lake St. Clair. Real nice farm, blacksmith, small little town. He was the trader, he was working out of there. And he didn't get on well with what they call the family in Ontario. Upper Canada was controlled by a very small group of aristocrats. And they iron-fisted. It was real tough to get property. It was real tough to get anything done. Westbrook ran afoul of them, and one of the two leaders of the gang wouldn't sell him more land so that he could expand his property, and eventually took over his farm. Westbrook fought against this family compact, and the family compact really becomes a problem during the 1830s for the Canadians. There's the Patriot War comes up, and that'll be in our next volume. But Westbrook ended up leaving his farm, eventually going back and burning his farm, so the guy who took it from him couldn't have it. Came over, made friends with Hull, went back to Canada, Sandwich and Windsor, and started handing out pamphlets, promoting the Americans coming in. We like the Americans. He's one of the guys who could have become part of the United States. He would have been in favor of this. Of course, things didn't go well for Hull. He lost the town. So Westbrook just basically became an outlaw. He would go over to Canada and kidnap their military leaders and hold them for ransom and get them back. He went back, he burned his farm, he burned other farms. He would, he was just kind of this raider under the radar, and the Canadians just vilified him. He ended up coming over here. He renamed himself Baron von Steuben and ended up living up kind of in the East China area of northern Lake St. Clair there, near, I guess that'd be near Marine City. He had property, had a very large land holding, and I think there's a von Steuben Street road up in that area kind of named after him. So a wonderful story, a crazy guy. I mentioned the Native Americans, and this really was their last opportunity to try to reverse the tide of European influx. When the French were here, they got along well. When the British came in, the British didn't get it. It was our way or the highway, and they didn't get along with the Native Americans at all, but they eventually figured it out. They figured out that they had to give gifts They had to do things to keep the Native Americans engaged, which eventually became kind of their downfall at Malden, because they'd ended up with like 3,000 people that they had to feed. And Malden was at the very end of the British food chain. You know, they could get stuff up to Mackinac, but Malden was really kind of the end of it. And to feed 3,000 people was really a stretch. It became a problem. The Americans couldn't figure it out. Hull was horrible with Native Americans. In fact, there's a chapter in here all about Hull's relationships with the Americans, Native Americans, and he just didn't get it, flat out. British had figured it out. Native American, or the Americans had not. It was the largest group of people in the region by far. I mean, just 10 times as many at least, but heavily dependent upon the British for the food, for their powder, for their shot. I mean, they had become, gone from completely self-sufficient to very dependent upon the British. And Tecumseh understood that problem. He really wanted to drive this war, drive these Americans away. We can deal with the British, we can't handle the Americans. And one of the greatest moments that we had in the book, a guy named Dan Harrison, who's a real clever fellow, overachiever, librarian, archaeologist, historian, diver. He's become a real good friend. But he just happened to be poking around on the internet, and he ran across this oral history that they use over at the University of Wisconsin in an indigenous language preservation and promotion program, whereby if you want to learn to speak Ojibwe or Ottawa, you can go there, and they've got these oral histories written in the original languages. And Dan ran across this one, and when he started reading it, he said it had been recorded back in the 60s by an Ottawa up on Manitoulin Island. And Dan said, this is the oral tradition of the War of 1812, the fall of Detroit, right here. And it starts with Hull going down toward Malden and getting stopped at the river and having to reverse. And then the Native Americans, who couldn't stand the British at this point because they kept dumping on them, finally getting together and going over and helping to take the city. So, you know, Dan just happened to trip over this, and it's the first time that I know of that it's been explored and analyzed, because, of course, the oral traditions, they can say something happens in a day, and what they mean is it happened in a decade. They're very poetic in their tradition and the way they tell the story, but if you break it down, you can see how the whole thing went, and it's just a wonderful thing. The bottom line of that story being that this was their battle. This wasn't the British battle. The British are keeping us alive with their food. They're getting in our way. If it were just ours, we could take care of the Americans. Now, there were, of course, atrocities. The River Raisin Massacre is an obvious one. But it's pretty clear now that the British committed atrocities, the Americans committed atrocities, the natives committed atrocities. You can't lump it all onto one. And getting to the fact that this was really a Native American war versus the Americans, it was a wonderful piece. That's worth the price of admission right there. I mentioned the women, and there were many. Happily, we got several examples in here. The husbands had left. When the Hull surrendered the fort, most of the troops who escaped did. It's arguably one of the reasons Cass did not get into the battle, is he had a hunch things were going to go bad, and so he took his troops and they headed south. They got into Ohio, they got away from the British so that they weren't captured, they weren't paroled, but they were gone. So that at Brownstown, at the River Raisin, in Detroit, at all the American settlements, there were very few men. Augustus Woodward stuck around because he was a lawyer, the first lawyer in Washington, D.C., he was proud to say. He was able to work with Proctor, who was the British commander, who was out of Malden but ran Detroit at the time. So he was able to work with him and get people food and avoid people being jailed for too long and that kind of thing. But other than Woodward, there weren't many men here. It was the women who did the thing. There was Nancy Hubbard here in Grosse Pointe. I don't know how many of you are familiar with her, but Nancy Hubbard lived in Grosse Pointe, and left a diary, which is, those things are just wonderful. Evidently, one day they were at her home, and of course it was her mother and her siblings, female siblings, and 2 or 3 canoes full of Native Americans pulled up. And an Indian woman first approached the Hubbard home. She then motioned to the men aboard the canoe, who quickly sprang ashore, ran up to the gate, and leapt over it like so many demons of the forest, and ran up to the house. Her oldest sister greeted them, invited them in, spoke kindly to them, offered them some food, some warmth, because it's cold outside today. They shouted at her. Of course, they tried to be mad. How can you be mad at a nice lady? I know how this works. But they did. And then they threatened the whole family, saying, if we find out they're Americans, we will come back and kill them. At that point, while the natives were eating, all the Hubbards took off. They got off down to some neighbors and left. In which case, in the family's absence, the natives plundered the home, destroyed its few possessions, even smashing dishes to pieces. They only passed over the clothing belonging to the sister who had greeted them, identifying them by her size and shape. I'm not sure what that means, but that's how they identified her. And so hers were the only thing. Sometimes it is nice to be nice to the natives. Great stories there. Elizabeth Anderson was another story. She was down at Frenchtown, and her husband was in the Army and came and went occasionally, but she was in charge of maintaining the farm. When the natives came there, you know, she's the one who's sitting on the trunk full of all of their possessions and all of their money, and, you know, bearing her breast saying, go ahead, kill me. And they don't. Indians respected that, and they didn't. I mean, it's another wonderful story that we've got in there. One of my favorites was Lydia Bacon, who was not from around here. She was a wife of a soldier, and she came in through a couple of other battles and ended up here. And she was at Tippecanoe. She was on the Cuyahoga when it got caught. She was one of those women. And again, she left a diary. And at the time, before the British took Detroit, they bombed it for a day. They just kept tossing cannonballs in. And she said, I felt as if my nerves would burst. My hair felt as if it was erect upon my head, which was not covered. And my eyes raised upward to catch a glimpse of the bombshells and balls that were flying in all directions. This is when she was out in the open. And then she got into a cellar with a lot of people who had crowded into the cellar. She said, what a scene here presented. Such lamentation and weeping I've never heard before, and sincerely hope I never hear again. And they kind of left the door open a crack so they could see the cannonballs falling on their houses and just pummeling the fort. So there's great first-person accounts of what was going on in Detroit at the time. Free blacks. This is an unusual time in Detroit history when the slaves were escaping from Canada and coming to the United States, because Woodward, who was still the judge here, or before the war started, refused to send them back. The British would not send, and we had slaves in Detroit. There were about 200 slaves in Detroit. Again, African Americans, some indentures, and some Pawnee, the Native American. And some of our slaves, you know, an indenture gets upset with his boss, he escapes across to Canada. Canada would not send them back. So Woodward said, well, if they're not sending them back when black slaves escaped to the United States, I'm not sending them back either. But there was a situation, in fact, Elizabeth IV was part of it, whereby the parents were manumitted, but according to the laws that were written in 1787 that formed the Northwest Territory, the parents could be freed, but the owner had the right to the children for 25 years after that. And Woodward had to, in fact, Elijah Rush was the lawyer in this case, and could not win this case. Woodward said they're still slaves, and so the kids had to go back. Elizabeth Denison IV eventually ended up coming over to the United States, settling on Grosse Pointe, and was a big part of starting St. Jim's Episcopal Church. They've got her picture down there as being that. And there were free blacks here. Hull, and probably the first time in American history, formed an all-black militia. Partly because he had a lot of guys, strong men, standing around who all he had to do was hand them a gun and teach them how to drill. And secondly, he knew that it really angered the British. They really did. They thought giving slaves guns, giving African Americans guns, you know, what a thing, what is he thinking? He's going to send them over here, they're going to be as crazy as the Native Americans. And he was almost right, although there's no evidence that they ever fought during the war. But the very fact that Hull, in writing out his orders, referred to the blacks in Detroit as persons. Same term he used to refer to white people in Detroit is kind of a telling thing, an important part of this. Of course, the Battle of Lake Erie's been done and done and done, and we try to do it a little bit differently. We look at it again from the people standpoint. Most of the two guys who were trying to put these things together, we know Oliver Perry was a master commandant at that point. He was never a commodore except as an honorarium. He was a master commandant, which was just below a captain. And then there was Lieutenant Barclay, who was up at Malden building his fleet there, Perry down at Erie building his fleet. And they couldn't get cannon, they couldn't get food, they couldn't get medicine, they couldn't get soldiers or sailors. Perry brought sailors with him. He came from the East Coast as a naval officer, and about half the sailors he brought with him were black. Said some of the damn finest men in my command. And he brought them, but he couldn't get any other sailors, and neither could Barclay. The people who were running the battle on Lake Ontario, Yeo and Chauncey were the commanders respectively, wanted to keep all the cannon, wanted to keep all the medicine, wanted to keep all the sailors to themselves. They felt they had the tougher job guarding Lake Ontario than Perry ever would on Lake Erie. He figured Perry was just gonna, that was kind of a stalemate. So these guys had to recruit, and they were recruiting from, the farmers and the militiamen who were hanging out with Harrison and Harrison's army. And Harrison sent him 100 and some men, but between the two of them, they should have had about 950 men to man the boats properly. And the whole complement, both navies, were about 450. And of that, about a third were sick. So when they entered this battle, when they went to the Battle of Lake Erie, all the boats were undermanned. They didn't have enough powder, they didn't have enough shot, they didn't have the right cannons. Perry ended up with a lot of carronades, which are really good for a short distance, like from here to the police station. And Barclay ended up with a lot of long guns, which are great at a long distance, but they don't do much damage, or not as much as a carronade at close range. So they had all the wrong stuff. It was a tough battle to fight. Barclay had more boats. Perry had more weapons. It was pretty clear that Perry should win the battle, and in fact, he did. But we covered it from the standpoint of the men who were on the boat. And there are a couple of good diaries that were left and have made some real good resources. Probably one of my favorite stories is about this poor guy, and this is 1870 now. So he was a young man when he was in Detroit. He came up with Harrison after the Battle of Lake Erie. They watched the Battle of Lake Erie from down in Sandusky, and then they got in rowboats and rowed over to the islands and helped kind of take care of the prisoners from that battle, and regrouped, and then they went over and landed just south of Malden, a fairly large army, 1,000, maybe 1,200 men, and basically took over that part of Upper Canada. They took over Malden. They had to deal with the Native Americans who had stayed behind, because at this point Proctor, who was in charge of the British forces, had abandoned. After the Battle of Lake Erie, he packed up and left. He was out of food. Between his garrison and the Native Americans, he was out of food. He had put most of his cannon and his powder on the boats, assuming that Barclay was going to win the battle. He did not. He abandoned Detroit. They burned parts of it and headed for the Thames, or really, they were heading for York, heading for Toronto to get out of here. Tecumseh is screaming at him to stop, stand and fight, get your tail out from between your legs, is the quote that's always used, and Proctor is not doing it. Proctor went over, stopped for a minute to fight at the Battle of the Thames, but as soon as Tecumseh was dead, and the Native Americans agreed to fight one last time, and they stood strong while Proctor and his contingent retreated. So the Native Americans, once again, just like at the Battle of Falling Timbers, the Native Americans are left holding the bag. Tecumseh dies, the rest of the natives, parley and have that problem. But this guy lived through it all. And his story about being a soldier during the War of 1812, sleeping on the ground, waking up in the middle of the night with your ear full of rain and rolling over to let that drain and let the other ear fill. Dealing with the problems of dysentery and cholera. 700 people died soon after the Battle of Lake Erie. In Detroit, in Malden, there was just and there weren't that many people around. 700 was a huge percentage of people to die. And dealing with the death that was going on around him, not being able to get paid, the food, what food you could find. I mean, they were scrounging in farms well into what's now Ontario, just trying to find food to stay alive. So the story that Josh Woodward tells about Sergeant Brunson is just wonderful. And Brunson was there as the Americans occupied Upper Canada right until mid-1815, well after the war is over. So that's essentially the war. The last section is after the war, and there's some great stories of how the Americans treated the Tecumseh legend, how they essentially built the Tecumseh legend. And this isn't to take away, Tim Moran doesn't, in fact, Tim Moran lives around here someplace. He's an East Grosse Pointe guy, professor down at Wayne. Doesn't take away from Tecumseh's powers as a leader, but it does show how the Americans, if we're going to lose or almost lose to this Native American, how does that happen? How can we possibly lose to him? He must be really, really, really smart. And so they built up this legend around Tecumseh about what an incredible warrior he was. And he was a great warrior, but the legend became kind of built on itself and became a national thing. And Tim Moran did a great job there. Apart from that, one of my favorite parts it was the Pacification Ball. After the war was over and word got to Detroit about February that the war was over, and they immediately started planning a ball. And they did this on the East Coast too. There was all kinds of celebrations because we had once again beat the British. Unless you ask the Canadians. Canadians are pretty sure they won this war, and arguably they had a tenth of the number of the people that we did, so they probably, I would argue, they did win the war. But big celebrations, and they were all called peace celebrations on the East Coast. In Detroit, Woodward and some of the folks who were still around here started putting together a pacification ball. We're not talking peace, we're talking just the fact that we're getting along together. And it was a wonderful affair that helped kind of ameliorate any ill feelings that were taking place between the two countries. Again, these people were relatives. They liked each other before the war. They were going to like each other after. It was a 3-day fete. Started on March 29th and went for 3 days. The first day was all guys. Guys got together at Woodward's Hotel, and they had a big party. And then the next day was a big ball that they had again at Woodward's Hotel, and the women were invited this time. And the party went on for 3 or 4 days, and at the very end of it, everybody went down to the river, and all of the people in the ribbon farms had candles out, luminaries essentially. They put luminaries out from Toledo to the mouth of the St. Clair River, which is really kind of a cool way to end the war, And in fact, I think the Bicentennial Commission, the State Bicentennial Commission, is going to try to replicate that again. So the War of 1812 isn't over until it's over, darn it. Okay? And that's going to be sometime at the end of March next year. It firmly established, one of the big things that the war did for the Great Lakes is it firmly established the border. Before it had been kind of, we weren't sure who owned what island, and the Rush-Bagot Treaty settled that. And James Sherian did a great job of digging into that treaty, finding out how it actually broke down. There were arguments over islands that went on for almost a century, but essentially the Rush-Bagot Treaty in 18 settled the border that we have. And it's the longest peaceful border that we've had in the world. There was a period of recovery, seeking retribution, rebuilding homes. This is a picture of John R. Williams, who John R. Street is named after. I think Williams Street is also named after it. He named a couple of streets after his wife and daughter. And not to take away from him, but he ended up taking off. He left Detroit. He was a merchant here, packed up his stuff. He was related to the Campbell family. So, you know, a well-off family in Detroit. He headed for Buffalo. First chance he got out of here, went to Buffalo. He lost a bunch of stuff on the Cayuga, just like everybody did. And when he got back, he started petitioning the government for redress for everything he lost, right down to 2 tablespoons of pepper. It was really kind of crazy. He was merchants you got to keep track of your books, you got to know everything you got. But frankly, John R. Williams was a little bit of a baby about it. And that makes another wonderful story in the book. It turned into a great period of expectation. This town started growing. We saw the town before the War of 1812. This is not long after, about 1820. Jim Conway would point out that there were some errors in this when John Gilsabs put it together. Real nice drawing. Here's Woodward's Hotel, where all the celebrations took place. Of course, Hull had been defrocked. He was accused of treason. He was sentenced to hang. I think Madison commuted the sentence, but he lived under that for years, and his relatives fought it for almost 2 centuries to try to get his name back. But Cass won the battle. Cass got named the territorial governor and came back, and he got the house right outside here, right on what turned into Cass Avenue. And here's Brush Street over on the other side, where Elijah Brush had gotten the old Askin estate. So those guys, I mean, this is kind of where much of our downtown came from. The town started growing. Of course, there were a couple of things that happened publicity-wise. People who wanted the Ohio Valley to keep growing really tried to dissuade people from coming into Detroit or Michigan itself. It was a great swamp. You know, the Tiffin, Edward Tiffin in 1815 put out this treatise about how everything north of the Ohio border is swamp and bug infested, and you just don't want to go there. And people believed it. People believed it as long as they could move west, you know, kind of through Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, until they got to those seas of grass without a tree as far as you could see. And everybody figured that land was just barren. And that's when, yeah, right. The breadbasket of the world. And that's when everybody started turning north and coming into the Great Lakes area. And there was a guy named Darby, who, well-respected travel writer, they had him back then, came into the Great Lakes region and wrote about it and completely debunked what Tiffin had written. And the Darby treatise is what really kind of opened things up. Once it was well read here, it was well read in Europe, widely distributed, and that's what really kind of turned the tide for people wanting to come into the Detroit area and come into the Great Lakes. And of course, it wasn't long after that the Erie Canal opened, but something I didn't realize, our immigration to Detroit really started ramping up as soon as the War of 1812 was over. They started building steamboats, first on Lake Ontario, and notably, when the Canadians wanted to build a steamboat, their first steamboat in Kingston, they sent out bids and they hired an American. This is 2 years after the war's over. So these things, these evil feelings toward each other went away pretty darn fast. And it's with that, with the advent of the steamboat, the opening of the Erie Canal certainly played a big part, and the fact that everybody understood that Michigan was not a swamp from one end to the other changed kind of the whole way our history developed after the war. And all of that can be found right here. For only $13.75, tax included, which we'll be going over afterwards. And I do have some stuff suggested reading for this. Richard White's Middle Ground is real good. It covers way before this period, but right up through 1815, and has a lot to do. The Middle Ground was, Detroit was in a spot between Native American clans, the Algonquin-speaking people and the Iroquois-speaking people, who didn't get along at all, and nobody got along with the Hurons. And Detroit was kind of a neutral zone. Iroquois to the south, Algonquins to the north. The three fires, the Potawatomi, Iroquois, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ottawa. great stories there. The Civil War of 1812, Alan Taylor was out at the University of California, San Diego, I think, who came in and did when we had a symposium for this. After all these guys wrote this, part of the project was they had to deliver their papers at the symposium, act like a real historian. And they did. Alan Taylor came in and gave our keynote. Tony Yannick's book, we've already mentioned that. And then Denver Brunsman, who was by far the lead editor on this project, for years has been working on books on naval impressment, which arguably between that and the problems with shipping and business were the two things that really set the war off. So if you really want to look into what laid the groundwork for this, and it's funny, we were talking about slavery and how after the American Civil War there was slavery by a different name. There were chain gangs, there was indentures, there were things that really kept people enslaved. Arguably, sailors, British sailors, American sailors, all sailors were kind of the last people to be freed from a slave-like situation. And having been a sailor all my life, the captain's word is whatever he says goes on a ship. But it's great if the captain's a smart, and honest, and moral person. It really can be ugly if the captain is not. And the sailors had no recourse, legal or otherwise. They could take the captain to court and they would lose. So slavery kept going. This is a great start for that. That's a whole other lecture. So that's what I've got. That's the war before, during, and afterwards, right here in the Detroit region. Detroit was incredibly important, and I hope this has added markedly to the literature on that. So bibliography at the end is worth the price of admission.
Very good. Thank you very much. Anyone have a question?
Okay.
What's the other book you've got tonight with you?
The Revolutionary Detroit War. So they're companion pieces, and we're hoping to start another one on the period between 1817 and statehood in 37. So that's our next project. I think it'll be that's an exciting period for me.
What officially brought the war to an end, and who instigated it?
I think it was just fatigue.
No, I mean officially. Was there a treaty, and who first proposed it? Who threw in the towel? Did it involve the president's signature? Did it involve?
It had to get ratified by Congress, yeah, but it was diplomats in Britain who were really angling to get it taken care of. And I should know that. I know that there was a lead British diplomat who figured this war is stupid and we're not going to get anything out of it. Let's finish it. And the Americans were more than happy to go along with that. And it basically, nobody won. It went back to the situation antebellum before the war started. All the borders were the same, all of the rules were the same, all the relationships between the countries remained the same. So arguably, nobody won. It was a draw. If the British hadn't been involved with Napoleon, we would have been in trouble. As it was, absolutely exhausted their resources, kept their navy, their incredible navy, away from us, and allowed us to actually have some positive things there. So it was. I think both sides were just really, really tired. So
The Indians lost.
That's exactly right. If there was a loser, it was the Native Americans, because there never was. I mean, arguably the Black Hawk Wars, as they were, put together, was a small confederacy led by Black Hawk, but most of the major leaders at that point, Walk in the Water and Little Turtle, who was the head of the Miami clan down in Ohio. They all got together at Fort Wayne, and there was the Treaty of Brownstown, and then there was the Treaty of Fort Wayne, and essentially just gave up, ceded. And some of them were forced to leave. Some of the Potawatomis ended up on the west side of Michigan. In fact, they're still there. Firekeepers. Potawatomi were known as the Firekeepers, hence the name of the casino. That's why they're over there. But they did. They were the losers.
On your map of Detroit showing Cass Avenue,
Yeah.
how far north did that go on the map?
On that map, it probably didn't extend much farther than the stockade.
Oh.
But if you look at the map of
Not to Wayne State
Detroit,
University then.
not at the time, no, it went up that far later on. But that wouldn't have been until the 20th century, early 20th century. But if you notice it's the fort wasn't square, and if you look at a map, Cass starts off about 3 blocks from Woodward, and by the time you get up to the historical museum, it's a block away. So it really held that line. The property between Brush and Cass was known as the governor and judge's lots, and they divvied those up, and they're still if you look at a plat map, it's still called the governor and judge's lots.
And the Trail of Tears,
It
is
was
that a
down
book
Georgia,
title?
down in Georgia.
Is
The
that a
movement
book
of
title?
No, there probably is one called that. It was the name, 20th century name given to a 19th century movement of Native Americans, mostly Choctaw and Cree and Creek. Cherokee. Yeah, and Cherokee, off to the Oklahoma territories. So, yep. Tuscarora, I guess, came north and joined the Iroquois Confederation, but they ended up getting moved too. The Port Delaware started out in Delaware, and they just kept getting moved west. It was now one of our happiest parts.
There was a sign on Wayne Road, New Joy Road, indicating that Tecumseh was buried there. Is that accurate?
Tecumseh was buried there?
Yeah.
I wouldn't even venture that. No, I mean he died over in Ontario, what's now Ontario. And there were all kinds of stories of atrocities of American soldiers cutting parts of him off to keep as a souvenir. I mean, if there was anything left to bury, supposedly his troops came back at night and spirited whatever was left
There's
away.
branches of the river were across right there.
Yeah, I would say that's probably a legend.
Yeah.
A legend and nothing more. I think they buried him in an unmarked grave so that the Americans couldn't defile him anymore. So.
Well, Joel's here to talk afterwards, sign books. We've got the most recent Grosse Pointe book, Legendary Locals of Grosse Pointe, and other books, and how this got our videos. If you haven't seen the Grosse Pointe Historical Society videos, there are 2 28-minute videos together on one DVD covering 16, from the Griffin coming on Lake St. Clair on the Feast of St. Clair, and the naming of Lake St. Clair up through 1900, and then 1900 to about 2000. So those are available. There's cookies, lemonade, and water.
Well, Larry's book on Detroit medicine is excellent,
Good. Okay.
and I know Charlie Hyde's coming.
Yeah, that's right.
Charlie Hyde has 2 new books.
Our lecture in September is, of course, September marks the 75th anniversary of the beginning of World War II, and Charlie Hyde, his recent book, The American Automobile Industry in World War II, Arsenal of Democracy.
Incredibly well
He's our
researched.
September speaker.
And there is a companion piece which is going to
Yeah, photographic book.
come out, which is, I call it his picture book, and he hated that. But it is, it's a beautiful, coffee table sized book of pictures that are down at the Skillman branch of the Detroit Public Library in the National Automotive History Collection. Incredible resource for the Arsenal of Democracy. And Charlie was able to put together the history book and the picture book, and it's a beautiful companion piece. I know he's kicking off the both books down at the Detroit Public Library and the Detroit Historical Museum all in one night.
Yeah,
on April 9th.
Yep, April 9th. Yep. So
Right there.
good. Well, thank you so much for coming, and
So,
look forward
in the
to seeing you
meantime-
hopefully in April and May.